The fabric of our politics was being pulled in ways that I had not seen before. And everybody was writing about the divisions in the country and what was tearing us apart and such. And so I stumbled across the Lincoln Highway and thought, wow, this would be a really fun and adventurous and wild way to explore what holds the country together.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation, in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities. Did I tell you about the two voices that I'm doing for Aaron lately?
No.
There's Dimsy, and he talks like this.
And then there's Radigan, and he talks like this. And they're two goons for a mob boss. And
what does Aaron think of these voices?
She thinks they're hilarious.
Oh, that's good.
How's Bart Bartson going on in your house lately?
Bart Bartson is pretty nervous about things these days. But he usually gets shouted down by Muesli the Schnoodle, who is actually the reincarnation of an Italian who fought on the side of the partisans during World War II, and has a very high voice. Papa, could you bring me some kibble, please? This reminded me of a time when we were sitting in an abandoned farmhouse and I was looking for kibble.
And what does your family think of this voice?
This voice has been around for, as long as Muesli the Schnoodle has been around. So they just kind of ignore it and go on with their lives.
It's impossible for Aaron to ignore me because we're the only two people in the house, right? I mean, there's the cat, but she's pretty vocal. But our house is small. So
sometimes I do the voice when nobody else is in the room. That's the best part. I'll be in the kitchen doing the dishes or something, and I'll be channeling Muesli the Schnoodle and her experiences during World War II.
I haven't gotten to the point where I'm talking by myself like this yet, but pretty soon. Gee, boss, I ain't never seen a dame that looked that good.
You know,
that kind of stuff.
Bronze is bad news.
I don't even know how it's. Why do any of these things start? Boredom.
Well, actually not long after I started voicing Muesli the Schnoodle, there was a whole article in the Washington Post about people who give their pets voices.
Oh, and is that linked to any sort of mental condition?
I was just going to say it's beyond just like a minor neurosis.
Right, yeah.
I don't know. And the reason we're talking about these voices has nothing to do with the interview we're about to hear with Frances Berry, who wrote a very interesting book that involved a road trip. And I don't know whether you've done your voices on a road trip. Muesli the Schnoodle doesn't usually drive with us very often, but Papa, I believe you should be shifting into a fourth gear by now.
You missed the exit.
The last time I went on a road trip, I'm sure I was doing other voices, but I can't think what they come and they go, and I'm sure in a couple of years I won't be doing Radigan or Dimsy anymore.
Are there legendary road trips in your history?
Yeah. So let's see. It would have been 20. I don't know what year it was. 20 something. My friend had told me that he wanted to move out to Arizona. My younger brother lives there, and my brother and his wife at the time said, hey, I know that you're kind of getting sick of the North Country. Why don't you come on out? We've got a room. Just pay rent. It's pretty cheap. And you find a job out here and start something new. And he was like, okay, yeah, well, I don't really have a whole lot going on for me up here. So at the time, though, he didn't have a car. All he had was a motorcycle. So he asked me one day, he was like, I know that this is a huge ask, but I don't really want to just rent a U-Haul and do this on my own. Is there any way you'd be interested? He's like, I know that it'd be difficult to take time off work or whatever, but I'll pay you. And I was like, you know what? I'm kind of sick of my job, so I'm going to quit. So I gave my job.
That was not your current job.
Not my current job.
Yeah.
No, it was my last radio job. So this was 8 years ago, I guess. So yeah, I gave my job 5 weeks notice, and I had I had a bunch of money in my savings. So
Got out your John Denver tapes.
I had a whole lot of John Denver tapes, a lot of Beach Boys CDs as well, and we loaded up a U-Haul, me and my girlfriend and my friend Rob, we loaded up a U-Haul. We attached it to my Toyota Camry, and we drove all the way from Potsdam, New York to Phoenix, Arizona, which is like 2,400 miles. And then we stayed there for about a month. You know, when you think about road trip, you think about like all the stops and stuff that you're going to make, but we were just like trying to get there. Once we got to Arizona, we saw a lot and we did a lot of traveling. We went out to Las Vegas. We might have gone to the Grand Canyon that trip as well. And I had a great time. We stayed for about a month and a half. And so me and my friend Rob were switching off. My vehicle was a standard, you know, so you have to do the manual shifting.
Papa, I believe you should be in a fourth gear by now. Oh, it's a little loud in the third gear. The tachometer is saying about the 3,000 RPM.
Stop. And so Aaron didn't know how to drive stick. So I thought in the time that we were there, we knew we'd be there for at least a month. I was like, I'll teach her how to drive. And I never did. So I drove the entire 2,400 miles back to Potsdam, New York. And yeah, by the time we got in the car, we had spent a lot of our money, and neither of us had jobs to come back to in Potsdam. So anyway, so yeah, that's like my big road
Interstate
trip.
40, great times.
Yeah. Super exciting, I guess. How about you?
Well, I can share the road trip story of moving away from Arizona,
Okay.
actually, in 2006. My wife and my, at that point, 1.5-year-old daughter and I were moving from Flagstaff, Arizona, not far from the Grand Canyon, the aforementioned Grand Canyon,
It's pretty big, you know?
It's grand,
big.
some might say. some might say the grandest.
Some are saying it's very big.
Anyway, we're moving from Flagstaff to just outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So a distance of 1,800, 2,000 miles, something like that.
Yeah.
And we had, at the time, not long before that, I'm trying to remember how long we had a Volkswagen Jetta wagon, left Flagstaff, and within an hour and a half of departing Flagstaff, the car had broken down.
Oh, no.
And this was, the car was like 2 years old, I mean, at maximum then. The car had broken down, and immediately following that, I came down with an ear infection. Oh, my God. Like my first ear infection since I was probably like 2 years old.
Unrelated to the car troubles, I'm
as
assuming.
far as I know, it was like an alternator problem, and I don't know that has direct impact on your ears, but it was like somebody had, shoved a skewer into my ear.
Oh, my God.
And the only doctor's phone number we had was my daughter's pediatrician.
Right, because this is what year?
This is 2006.
So before your smartphone, right?
Yeah, it was before we had a smartphone, or if we did, it was a really basic. It was definitely before we had a smartphone.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and right, there was no like logging on to our MyChart app or whatever. And by then I had left my previous job, so we were essentially without health insurance. We'd paid, like the 1 month Cobra thing. And but fortunately we were friends with her pediatrician who diagnosed me over the phone and sent in a prescription for whatever you take for an ear infection to the Walmart in Gallup, New Mexico, which is where we had managed to limp our way into.
Oh, man.
And then, of course, it turned out that the closest Volkswagen dealer was in Albuquerque, which was another 3 hours past that. And so the next day, we had to load the completely filled car onto the back of a tow truck and rent a car to drive from Gallup to Albuquerque, where it took another day to get the car fixed, by which point we had missed the wedding that we were supposed to go to on the drive back from Flagstaff to Milwaukee.
That's
and then we
brutal.
got to Milwaukee. The first day we were in our new house, we got the car parked in the garage, and the garage door broke with the car trapped inside, and I had to break into the window of the garage to free it up.
None of this struck you as a bad omen about your move?
A lot of it struck me as a bad omen about my move.
Oh, man.
Well, so the reason we're talking about road trips is because Francis Berry, who he actually goes by Frank, took an epic road trip with his wife on the eve, the months leading up to the 2020 election.
Oh, okay.
Remember that it was middle of COVID at that point, and so there's definitely something to be said for getting out of the house, and they bought a used RV.
Okay, cool.
And
I would love to do that.
I don't think we actually got into this in the interview, but the recurring problem they had was that the pedal that allowed them to flush the toilet on the RV kept breaking.
Oh, no. Don't want that to happen on a long road trip.
No, you do not. So what ended up coming out of this book, they took this road trip because he was really interested in kind of gauging the things that still hold the country together, or still were holding the country together circa 2020. And what emerged from it was his book called Back Roads and Better Angels. They traced the Lincoln Highway, which we'll get into pretty early in the interview. You don't have to know what the Lincoln Highway is at this very moment, because you'll find, if you don't know, you'll find out very shortly. But essentially no interstates at all, or very few places where the Lincoln Highway is now an interstate. And the idea was it would be the first coast-to-coast improved road, from obviously a century ago, named for Lincoln, and the specter of Lincoln looms large over every place that they visit.
Cool.
It's a really interesting book, especially to think about at a time when America seems to be even more divided than ever. And so we reach out to him. Francis Berry also lives part-time in the Adirondacks, or in the Adirondack region. He lives in Hague, which is on the shores. I think it's the northern part of Lake George, or the southern part of Lake Champlain. But anyway, he has good local Adirondack street cred, if you will. Frank Berry, welcome to Northwards. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Before we get to what you found along the way, why did you decide to take this epic road trip in the first place when you did?
Well, the idea of driving the Lincoln Highway had been rattling around in my head for a few years by the time 2020 rolled around. And the origin of the idea really was in early 2016, when Trump was transfixing America, people loving or hating him. But kind of the fabric of our politics was being pulled in ways that I had not seen before. And everybody was writing about the divisions in the country and what was tearing us apart and such. And so I stumbled across the Lincoln Highway and thought, wow, this would be a really fun and adventurous and wild way to explore what holds the country together in the midst of all these divisions. Lincoln being the guy who, more than anyone in our history, held us together during our time of deepest darkness. And so that was the origin, 2016. But it's a little hard to just take off on the road and go traveling cross country. So it didn't really come together until the pandemic rolled around. And then in 2020, my wife and I were working from home, working remotely. And we no longer had to go into an office every day, and our bosses didn't really care where we were as long as we were getting our work done. And so we looked at each other and said, or more accurately, I looked at Laurel and said, hey, maybe this is our time.
Well, and not only this was your time, but this was your time to do it, and to do it by buying an RV.
Right, because it was a pandemic, so we didn't want to be staying in a hotel every night. One, expensive, but two, I would be, speaking with people, interviewing them, and we wanted to be safe, and I didn't want to be, of course, spreading COVID across the country if I did get it. So that would not have been a good story, one man super spreader. So we decided to look into buying a used RV. Neither of us had ever driven an RV before. But it seemed like the best way to do it, the fun way to do it. And so we didn't know anything about RVs, but we tried to learn a little bit, and we found what we decided was as a 26-foot Winnebago, 30,000 miles. And we thought of it as the biggest RV we wanted to drive and the smallest RV we wanted to live in.
Well, so for people who might have only just heard of the Lincoln Highway but don't know anything about it, or maybe people who might not have any idea what we're talking about, can you give us a primer? Because in many ways and in many places, this is a highway. I'm using air quotes that no one can see on the radio. This is a highway in name only.
That's right. It's hardly a highway, in fact, but it was the first road to connect the two coasts of the country. It runs from New York to San Francisco. It was dedicated in 1913 at a time when most roads in America were farm roads. They were mud, they were dirt. Crossing the country was exceedingly difficult. Would take an average for those who dared to attempt it. Would take an average of about 2 months. And so, this early pioneer of the auto industry, Carl Fisher, had this brainwave of building a coast to coast rock highway, as he called it. And he convinced a bunch of people, other executives in the auto industry, to get behind it. And the idea was that if they could convince communities and they could build this highway, more people would go driving. That would be good for sales, and it would be good for people to see more of their own country. So the first slogan of the Lincoln Highway Association in 1913 was "See America First." That was the origin of the highway. Now, as you said, it's not really a highway, in part because they dedicated it in 1913, but they really just dedicated a map. There was no highway. And they essentially challenged communities to go out and build it. But most communities didn't because they didn't have the money to do it. But it did help spur interest in road building, and it did help spur what became the first major federal investment in local road construction a few years after that.
Well, and in some ways, it seems like the Lincoln Highway is emblematic of what you were trying to find along the Lincoln Highway, something that brings everybody together.
Exactly. It becomes a metaphor not just about Lincoln, but the road itself becomes a metaphor for or a symbol for what holds us together, what brings us out and brings us along traveling this same road as Americans.
But if this were just going to be a road trip book, you could have taken Route 66 or I-90 or whatever. The other part of the story is the Lincoln part of the Lincoln Highway, and Lincoln really undergirds a lot of what you write about.
Yeah, well, I found as I read about Lincoln, and that was one of the good things about waiting 4 years to do this trip was I spent quite a bit of time digging into Lincoln and the history of that era. And there was so much that I found resonant to today's politics, so much of what Lincoln embodied and the values that he brought to bear, the way that he approached issues, the principles around which he modeled his leadership. Those all seemed really relevant to where we are today. And so, as we traveled along and as the book moves along, I try to dig into that history in ways kind of there's a lot of Lincoln history along the Lincoln Highway, as it turns out. Civil War history along at least the first third of the Lincoln Highway. And so I tried to dig into some of that and discover what was relevant to today's America.
There are a lot of places where you encountered quotations that were attributed to Lincoln that he likely or definitely never said. Do you get the sense that today people make Lincoln into whoever they want him to be?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been doing that for a very long time, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But you're right. We saw lots of quotes. My favorite was the one on the side of a pub in Iowa. Of course, Lincoln was not a drinker, barely touched the stuff. But there he is quaffing a stein of beer, and the quote is, "Whatever you are, be a good one, A. Lincoln." And of course, he never said it. But that's okay because we have Lincoln is larger in memory in so many ways because we look to him as a unifying force. And that was also part of the idea for the book was that at a time when we find so few things that we agree on, including at a time when there was huge debates over historical figures, and Lincoln was swept up in some of that as well. But for the most part, Lincoln has transcended those partisan differences, and Democrats see things that they want to see him, and Republicans see things that they want to see him and see in him. But they both view him, and really all groups of Americans tend to view him as a figure who is worthy of admiration. And so, just finding something like that is not easy to do these days. And so, he became a useful guide for us as we travel across the country.
Well, and I think one of the other interesting things that you make clear that I think many of us have overlooked is what a pragmatist, what a skilled politician Lincoln was. And for as principled as he was, many times he did things because they were the best he could accomplish with the people that he was working with.
Absolutely, and you're right that part of his life and leadership is often overlooked. He was very much the pragmatist, an incrementalist, always pushing things along, but never getting too far ahead of public opinion. And that was something that Frederick Douglass said about him in eulogizing him. He said, by the standards of the abolitionists like himself, he was slow and tardy, but by the standards of public opinion, he was swift and determined. Lincoln was always looking to lead, but also recognizing that he couldn't be too far ahead. Had he been an abolitionist, he never would have been elected president. And so it's very easy to look back now and say, oh, Lincoln was not progressive enough. He wasn't an abolitionist. He was a racist. Okay, fine. But he pushed the country forward and he understood what it took to do that. And that is the essence of leadership. It's one thing to stand on a soapbox and to be righteous, but righteousness doesn't really produce results. And Lincoln always was interested in results. And sometimes that was winning elections and sometimes it was winning a war.
Bear with me on this one because this is kind of a long and maybe tortured question. I apologize in advance, but so it's funny. I was reading your book just the other day while I was standing in this long, very slow moving line to sign in at my town's grievance day, where you officially challenge the assessment they make on your house and property. And I was reading the part where you were recounting your sister's town and how one day years ago, volunteers got together and rebuilt the school's playground. And then you contrast it with the next time it needed replacing. And at the same time I'm reading this, the people around me are arguing and talking and discussing how their tax dollars are and aren't being spent. And it all came back around to Lincoln's take on the object of government, which also went back to a speech you worked with Mario Cuomo on during Mayor Bloomberg's run for the presidency. Can you go into detail about what Lincoln was getting at in that speech?
Yeah, Lincoln was talking about, as you say, the role of government. And he took, as we were saying, a very pragmatic approach to it, where he said that the purpose of government is to do for people what they can't do for themselves. But in all that people can do for themselves, government ought not to interfere. And so he was taking a little bit, today we might say, a middle of the road approach to recognizing that government is essential to doing things that we cannot do individually, but we should be careful not to expect it to do things that we ought to and can do for ourselves. And so that example of a playground was a case where in the 80s, this small community where my sister lived had built this playground for local school, and it was a real community bonding event. People came together, they raised money for supplies. They spent their Saturday hammering it together and building this playground that was really a community treasure for a couple of decades. And now, when it came time to replace it for a variety of reasons, including insurance liability and costs, and also potentially the difficulty of rounding up volunteers, they decided to contract it out and have a builder come in and build the replacement. And it speaks to, I think, the need for communities to be able to recognize that we cannot expect government to do everything. And when we do expect it to do things that we perhaps could do ourselves, we lose a little bit of social capital. And we lose a little bit of the bonds, they get loosened in terms of what holds us together as communities, what holds us together as Americans. I think, and if you take that lens and expand it outward to bigger national issues, I think it helps to put some perspective on debates over welfare reform or any other big government issue where I think often the right expects people to do everything for themselves and the left expects government to do everything for the people. And the truth is that the solutions usually lie in between, or at least sometimes do, and we should not always expect it to be one or the other.
Well, and this really speaks to that idea we were talking about before, of people using Lincoln in whatever way is expedient to them, because Democrats might focus on the first half of Lincoln's statement and Republicans might focus on the second half.
And that is exactly what has happened. And so that quote from Lincoln about the role of government has been used by Democrats from FDR to Obama to talk about the importance of government doing for people what they can't do for themselves. But that second half, and I was guilty of this too as a speechwriter for Mayor Bloomberg, is often forgotten. And that is that government should not do for the people what they can do for themselves.
There were some surprises, at least to this reader's eyes, as you went along. You spent a fair amount of time in Indiana, where you went to school, and I think living here in the Northeast, we think of Indiana as a northern state, and yet there's a real reckoning that many people in that state are doing on the history of race relations in Indiana. That's still in a lot of ways very close to the surface.
Yeah, very much so. And that was a bit of a revelation for me through this journey, was coming to recognize how deeply racism was embedded in the history of Indiana. Of course, it's all over the country, but though I spent 4 years in Indiana, was in college, was not aware of the extent to which the Klan had been headquartered there in the 1920s, and that was really its major base of power when it revived a second time and came to power and influence in the 20s. And those included there. So went to school at Notre Dame, and which is in South Bend, Catholic town. And there had been a major clash on the streets, in fact, on the Lincoln Highway in South Bend, between the Klan and students at Notre Dame in 1924. And I was shocked to learn of this episode here, 25 years later. And I thought, well, yeah, I must have just missed this at college. I mean, everyone else must have picked up on this history, this lesson. So I asked some of my classmates if they had heard about it, and to a person, nobody had. And I think it reflects so much of the pain that is infused in that history, that Irish America struggled for, and Catholics struggled for a very long time to gain his acceptance as full Americans. For a very long time, the belief was Catholics were loyal to the Pope. They could never be true Americans. They were a threat, in fact, to what America was. And it wasn't really until after John Kennedy that those fears and prejudices finally began to subside. And I think as they did, Catholics were happy to put them behind them and did not want to talk about them, did not want to make big issues of them. And that's, of course, understandable. That's the way, communities often deal with pain. But the trouble with not telling those stories and not passing them down to the next generation is that we have a hard time recognizing ourselves in other people, in other groups, when they go through similar things. And so I found time and again as we traveled across the Lincoln Highway that so much of what Catholics had experienced in the 1920s and in the century really leading up to it is being experienced today by Muslims and to some extent by Latinos as well. The idea that these groups are threatening to America, are un-American at their core, is something that Catholics experienced as well. And I think it's important that history be recovered more.
And that actually takes us neatly to another place where you found what might be surprising to people, and that was Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and its history of welcoming Muslims.
Yes, in fact, the very first mosque in America was built in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, which I had not expected to discover as we set out on the Lincoln Highway, but there it was, built about 100 years ago after the Muslim community there, immigrants from Syria and elsewhere, had helped the local Christian community build a church in a very American way. They turned around and said, "Well, now can you help us build a mosque?" And they did. And Cedar Rapids has a great long history of welcoming immigrants, and the Muslim community there is part of it. And I spoke with the imam, who was an immigrant himself, and he talked about how after the 9/11 attacks, how the community had rallied around the mosque, had sent flowers, had sent food baskets. Politicians came to say that we know who you are. You are our neighbors. You are not them, being the terrorists. And that was incredibly meaningful to them. But, and this was the sad part, he said that in recent years that has begun to dissipate, and the area has faced more threats, and feelings of being more ostracized have arisen again. And so that was very difficult to hear.
Yeah. At just about every step along the way, you found someone to ask your central question, what binds all of us together? Did you find a single through line in the answers that you got from, sea to shining sea, if you will?
Well, there were a lot of different answers. A lot of people reached into history, so that was one through line. They said the Constitution, they said the Declaration, they said, or they leaned into values. That was a through line. We love our freedoms. People talked about their own communities. So the part love, kind of the religious love for neighbor was a through line. But what was interesting about that question was what I didn't hear until we got to the very end of the Lincoln Highway. And the idea was we left New York on 9/11, and the idea was to get to San Francisco at the end of the Lincoln Highway on Election Day. And we did make it there on Election Day. And I don't want to. I don't want to
Spoiler alert.
spoiler here, but there was a construction worker I spoke to on Election Day in San Francisco who talked about elections and accepting the results of elections as being essential to what holds the country together. And as it turns out, that is absolutely true and really at the heart of everything else. And so the second half of the book takes place against the backdrop of the post-election period in 2020 as Stop the Steal begins to rise, and it builds up to, of course, the events in Washington on January 6th.
The maybe sad truth to the and maybe the postscript of this book is that you spent all this time asking what ties the country together, and in the time since the book first came out, it seems as though we're even further apart than we were when you took this trip.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. We are. And the only thing that I take some comfort and strength in, and it's not a small thing, is the sense of resilience that I heard from people that we spoke to all along the trip. When I would ask them about the divisions in the country and whether they were optimistic about our ability to overcome them, they would say almost to a person, yes. And I would ask why, and they would not necessarily be able to put their finger quite on it, but they would reflect on the fact that we've been through a lot as a country. And that is an absolute historical truth, that the resilience of the country, partly because of the Constitution, but largely because of the values that led to it and that are enshrined in it, is a huge part of what holds the country together. And people of all parties, I think, do have a sense of that and a belief in it. And even as we've got all of these divisions, I think that that is something that is really important to hold on to, especially when you're feeling pessimistic about where we are at the current news cycle.
All right, so I don't want to end this on a pessimistic note. I want to end it by asking you about the one rule you had for this trip, which was if you passed a restaurant shaped like the food they served, you had to stop. Does one food-shaped restaurant stand out above all the rest?
Well, we made that rule in part because we were not going to stop at fast food joints, so no McDonald's and such. But if we saw something shaped like the food it served, absolutely must stop. And so we thought that it might, maybe we'd see a place shaped like a steak or, no, it was almost all ice cream cones. So we had a lot of ice cream, including ice cream in the morning for breakfast. But that was the rule, and we were going to stick to it.
Well, it's made me very jealous, not of the ice cream itself, although a little bit there, but of the road trip, because it just sounds like a delicious experience in so many ways. Frank Berry, thank you so much for sharing it with us.
Thanks for having me.
That's Francis Berry, author of Backroads and Better Angels, A Journey into the Heart of Democracy. And Ethan Shanty back in the studio with us. Ethan's our producer. And what do you have to say for yourself?
These folks did the thing that I have always wanted to do, which is to buy an RV and drive all over the country, not with any sort of intent on like writing a book or exploring the politics of America. I just wanted, I know that I'm a lot different from other people my age who have designs on buying a house or having kids. I don't want any of that. I want an RV and I want to own a cabin on the water. And those are the only two things that I really desire in this world.
What about his other rule of thumb for the trip, which is if you pass a restaurant that's shaped like the food that they serve, you have to stop?
That's a really good rule. I think I will adopt that rule for my everyday life from now on. There are not enough hot dog stands shaped like hot dogs. I've been saying that for many years.
Maybe you could combine it all and like have the Wienermobile towing a trailer.
I don't know that it works for every food. I mean, I don't know that
bacon, for example.
Well, okay, then it'd be like really tall and skinny. I guess that could work. I was thinking that a building shaped like spaghetti would be a little disconcerting.
Grits.
Building shaped like grits.
Yeah. I guess that could be the building material. It's like
the grit house. It's made of grits and shaped like grits.
The meta grit house. Ethan, get us out of this. Tell us who produces this show.
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, produced, and edited by Mitch Teich with digital production supervision by me. I'm Ethan Shanty. To find out more about this show, to support it, and hear past episodes, visit ncpr.org/northwards. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.